this is a talk given by me, but it was co-authored one way or another by somebody called Jobst Landgräber, who is actually in on this call. I will introduce Jobst briefly. So first of all, he and I co-authored this paper, which you can find on archive.org, which summarizes, which expands some of the material on language, which I'm going to start with today. Now, Jobst is a very interesting figure. He started life reading Kant on the knee of his grandfather, Ludwig Landgräber. And then he studied mathematics and biochemistry and medicine. He was for a time a practicing physician, worked as a research bioinformatician on Alzheimer's related projects, then worked for a long time as a senior manager and entrepreneur in a large worldwide consulting company. And then he gave all that up and started a company called Cognotect, which is developing AI applications in various industries in Germany, and I think potentially also in the United States. And we've known each other for some years because we're both interested in the philosophical aspects of medical informatics. I guess that's a roughly appropriate description. But for the last couple of years, we've been working insanely often together on issues relating to the philosophical foundations of AI. And some of our examples are in medicine and biology. In fact, we use a lot of biological information in the book that we're writing, as well as mathematical information and information about physics and information about philosophy, both good and bad. And some of that will be the topic of this talk, as you will see. So the basic motto of the book is that you can only understand AI if you have a radically interdisciplinary approach, including the physics, the mathematics, the biology of intelligence, for instance, the physics of computers, the entire history of human evolution, and several other things on top of that, as well as computing and statistics and various other disciplines. All right, so these are the chapters in the book which we are currently writing. I'll be going through bits and pieces of this list of chapters as we go along. And so we start with intelligence, then we go to language, then we go to social behavior. Then we have the mathematical centerpiece of the whole book, where we talk about the mathematical limits to AI. And then we draw conclusions from that mathematical centerpiece. And today I'm going to be drawing conclusions about digital immortality and brain emulation, brain enhancement, and various other subjects. So we start with language, and we have a view of language according to which language is learned by human beings in a process which brings about a large set of physiological changes in the human being, so that the human being has many competencies or capabilities. Basically, all of the competencies or capabilities which we use when we speak or understand or write or type language. These form an aggregate in each individual, an aggregate of capabilities. And we're going to view a language as a whole as the entire aggregate of all those aggregates of capabilities. And so this aggregate will have fuzzy boundaries, as you will see. Each dialect is a sub-aggregate of this total aggregate of competencies. So a dialect is really just a part of a language in this sense, and the language is really just a very big dialect, which includes all the other dialects as parts. And now, because we have these competencies, we can speak and understand. That's called performance. Now we'll consider one particular dialect continuum, which is the West Germanic dialect continuum, which includes German and Swiss German at one extreme, and English at the other extreme. Even the English is spoken in Ireland is part of West Germanic. And we're going to look particularly at Netherlandic German and at the dialect continuum, which is formed between Dutch and various German accents, dialects such as Ripuarian and North Rhenish and so forth. And we'll look at a very simplified picture. So we have Standard German on the one hand, which is spoken in, which is the reference language in various parts of Germany, also in Switzerland and Austria. And then we have Standard Dutch, which is the reference parts of various parts of Holland, Belgium, and South Africa. And so everyone who speaks a Dutch dialect thinks that they're speaking Dutch, and everyone who speaks a German dialect thinks that they're speaking German. But, and you can see that they are closely similar, the very names of the two groups of languages in the way I've expressed it here anyway, look similar. And, but once you get down to the area where the two sets of dialects meet, you have a dialect continuum, because the people on the Dutch side of that boundary can understand perfectly well the people who are speaking on the German side of that boundary. In fact, they are speaking the same dialect, or they have been at various points in their history. But the people on the left think that they're speaking Dutch, and the people on the right think that they're speaking German. It's just that they're speaking dialects which are the same dialect. Now, the reason why I raise all of this is to show that there are very many factors affecting language which are locally very specific. Everybody who uses language is manifesting locally very specific features in their language use, and the locality may be very large. It may be the whole country, or it may be just your village, or just your street, or just your gang. Now, this is obviously going to be a problem if we want to build a Turing machine which can speak, which can master human language, because it's going to have to master language in such a way that it can cope with this local specificity. Moreover, which can cope with this local specificity, even though it's changing over time, sometimes very quickly. So languages are always changing. There are always slow drifts over thousands of years, which have always happened. But there are many ways in which language is rapidly changing. So we all talk about COVID phenomena, using new words which didn't exist even a year ago. We add new words to the language all the time. But also, when we're growing up, we're changing the way we speak all the time, not only because we're growing up and becoming more intelligent, learning more things, but also because we're trying to show our alliance with the other people who are of our age. But then as we get older, we will be embarrassed about the way we speak, and so we'll shift to a slightly older dialect because we want to belong, or we want to be counted as not belonging by proving that we're not speaking in the way that people in the next street or the next town or or our parents speak. And so if you live in a village, you'll probably, some of you anyway, will want to speak as they speak in the city. And that's one of the reasons why the people who speak in the village on the border with Germany, who speak the Dutch dialect, will also be able to understand the Dutch spoken in the cities nearby, which the Germans will not be able to understand. And then we all want to speak in such a way that we sound like celebrities like Beyonce and so forth. And so in that way, also our language is changing all the time. And it's changing according to context. It's changing according to who we're speaking to. It's changing according to a whole series of other things all the time. All right, so this means that our neurophysiological structures have to be very flexible. And this neurophysiological structure idea is at the basis also of Searle's understanding of how language works, which will be important later on. Now, we have these neurophysiological structures for two reasons. One, genes, which provide what we can think of as predispositions, general capabilities. And then we have capabilities which we get from our parents and from our peers and from other sources. And genetically, of course, we do not have the ability to speak English, but we do have the ability genetically to speak a language. But in order to be able to speak some specific language, which is useful to speak, then we need to learn it. In other words, we need to have acquired capabilities and not only innate capabilities. And this means not only neurophysiology for our brain, but also neurophysiology for the rest of our bodies, because we need the stomach, for instance, in order to speak, because the stomach provides the air, which we then control when we allow the air to pass through our teeth, for instance. So it's very complicated learning how to speak, hugely complicated. All right, so Turing comes along and puts forward a Turing test, which is called the man-woman imitation game. This was the first version of the Turing test. And the idea is that you have a man and a woman in two separate rooms and an interrogator. And the job of the interrogator is to work out which room the woman is in. And both of the people in the rooms are supposed to be working on convincing that they are the woman. So the woman can just be a woman, but the man has to fool the interrogator so that the interrogator will think he's a woman. And all the interchange is done on what used to be called a telex machine. In other words, everybody's typing and their questions and answers to each other. So the interrogator asks questions by typing them. It's a bit like text messaging, I suppose. And then the woman and the man give answers. And the woman is an ally of the interrogator. The man is trying to fool the interrogator. Now, the famous Turing test is a computer-human version of this game. And basically, it's just a human interrogator. He's trying to guess whether the messages he's receiving from the thing in the room are messages coming from a human or from a machine. And Turing says that the machine will pass the test if it can convince at least 30% of interrogators that it is a human after 5 minutes of questioning. So this was Turing's idea of how we will be able to know when a machine can think, roughly speaking. Namely, we will know that a machine can think when we can't tell whether it's a human that we're talking to or a machine. And he thought that by the end of the trial, he missed this, that we would have learning machines that could pass the test. We just need to get quicker, bigger computers and better programs. And so some people claim that in 2014, which is 14 years after Turing's prediction, some machine did indeed pass the Turing test. Namely, I think he was supposed to be an 8-year-old boy from the Ukraine speaking English. This sounds like cheating in multiple ways, but still, this is Eugene, and this is an extract from the conversation which convinced 30% of the interrogators. Now, I find this conversation very intriguing. And it's certainly not what you would expect from a machine. But it's not what you would expect from a human either, unless the human was trying to trick you into thinking that he was a machine trying to trick you into thinking that you were a human. And that's my assessment. It just doesn't make sense as a human conversation. And it doesn't make sense either as a machine conversation. But still, there it is. They claimed that they passed the test, and the Journal of Experimental and Theoretical Artificial Intelligence was convinced enough that they published the paper. Now, clearly, there's something wrong if an 8-year-old Ukrainian boy machine can be counted as passing the test. So we need a much better test, because this is not an example of thinking. And remember, Turing, I don't know what it is an example of, but it's not thinking. Remember, Turing wanted a test that could be used as a good proxy for whether machines can think. So we need a stronger test, which we call the Stasi test. So first of all, the subject has to be an adult. I don't think the Stasi was allowed to interrogate children, although that's an interesting empirical question. The interrogation should be able to go on forever until the interrogator decides he's had enough. But 4 to 6 hours was the typical length of a Stasi interrogation. And the interrogation shouldn't be restricted to question answering, and it should be in dialogue form, because it's the emotions which are important. Now, we have a general question here. Why do human beings, when they meet for the first time, always talk about each other? And Eugene didn't do that, you will notice. The interrogator didn't make him do that, which was a mistake on the part of the interrogator. The thing is that we do that because we want to determine whether the person we're talking to is trustworthy. So we start by checking that they have a good story about where they're from, what they believe, what they do at work, who their friends are, what they value, and so on. This is the way human beings determine whether they're going to continue interacting with somebody who is a stranger, because a stranger may be dangerous, and so they may be trying to cheat you. And so we try to determine trustworthiness by talking about biographies. So to pass the Stasi test, the machine would have to have a cover story. Now, your cover story, you can elucidate in infinite detail. There are all kinds of things from your life's history that you remember, and many things that you just make up. You can go on and on talking about your preferences and what you think about this and that. And the machine would have to be able to do a similar thing. That's what the Stasi interrogator would make the machine do. And he would try to find holes in the story. He would try to, most of all, find clues that the machine was not responding in telling the story in a human way. Because when humans tell their life story, even now when I'm telling a story about my life story, I'm becoming excited. I have all kinds of pride and regret, and this comes through. And the interrogator will know whether the emotions are coming through. And he would catch the machine after about 4 minutes, I assume. He would immediately know that it was a machine, because he knows how to find out whether someone is lying. So bring back the Stasi, that's what I say. All right, so why is it important that you work out whether your interlocutor is lying? Because language makes it easy to lie. And so we have a very, very elaborate set of strategies for testing whether someone is lying. And these have been evolved over millions of years. So cheater detection mechanisms are old in evolutionary history. They predate language, but they've been becoming refined ever more with the evolution of language, precisely because language is such an easy medium in which to tell lies. You can't tell lies by gestures. You can't tell lies by facial expressions in any way which is as easy as telling lies by using language. So this is why machines can't pass the Turing test. The first reason is that the number of dimensions of variance is so huge because of this dialect, location, context business. And I'll give some examples of these dimensions of variance in a minute. But also, and remember, these are dimensions of variance which we can all we all have mastered, thanks to our 8 million years of evolution, but also thanks to our 20-something or more years of speaking to people. Now, that's the first reason. We don't have enough data to train a neural network. And that's the preferred way of building a machine to solve the Turing test. The second reason is that even if we had the data, we still couldn't program the machine. And that's what the book is about, actually. That's what's new in the book, that even if we had enough data, and we'd need gazillions of pieces of information to even get close to training a machine to speak English in a way which exhibits adult human mastery. Even if we had all that data, we still couldn't program the machine. All right, so we can do lots of things with machines and language. So Google Translate can do a pretty good job about normal everyday language translation. But for that, it uses 213 million parameters. And now, if I'm getting this right, and Jobst can correct me if I'm wrong, that means that when you express the mathematical model underlying Google Translate in the form of a gigantically long polynomial, which is what a neural network roughly is translated as, then it would have 213 million units in it, connected together by pluses and so forth. And now I would say, and I was planning to correct this slide before I left it in here, the variance of dialogue is so much greater than what is involved in translating from one sentence to another, that you're going to need many, many more parameters. Now, I'm not sure it would be 213 raised to the power 30. It might be 213 raised to the power 24.7. We'll come back to that magic number later on. That's because translation is easy, because we have already a huge amount of training data, which we know is good training data, because we have huge amounts of translations of texts all over the place in many languages. But we have very little in the way of dialogue data. And what is more important is that half the relevant data we can never record for machine purposes, because it's the data which relates to what goes on in our minds when we understand and interpret someone's contributions to a dialogue. Not to mention all the emotional data which goes hand in hand with dialogue and so forth. All right, so that very quickly, these are some examples of types of variance. First of all, the modality with which you might be engaging with your dialogue partner. So I never tell jokes and I never tell lies. I do flatter occasionally, but anyway. Then we have cognolect choice. So dialects can be cognolects, which means that they belong to specific people with specific expertise or roles, or specific groups of people with complementary expertise or roles, like the ones listed here. And then we have different codes and styles of and tones. So it's different when you're drunk, or when you're a priest, or when you're courting somebody, you speak with a different style. When you're romancing somebody with your guitar, then you speak by singing. That's so the Turing machine would have to cope with that also. So although I'm not sure that the Stasi interrogator would be so happy if you started courting him with a guitar, if you're a machine. And then we have the dialogue horizon, which is a particularly important kind of variance, because it goes off in logically very complicated directions. So when you're engaging in a dialogue with someone else, there's always a context, a penumbra of possibilities, things which might happen. You may need to leave the dialogue quickly, and you know that, so it's affecting every contribution that you make to the dialogue. Or you may be afraid that somebody might join the dialogue and upset things. Or you may be afraid that, I don't know, you will not get a drink. I don't know. There are all kinds of ways in which the dialogue can be affected by things which might happen. And the most important kind of dialogue horizon phenomenon is when the dialogue itself becomes its own horizon. This is not quite an example of that, but it's a good example, so I'll give it to you. So this is the contribution to the dialogue. Someone is telling someone else that after Paris, they need to get to Abbeville before nightfall. So this is obviously two British tourists, because this was in English, planning to go from Paris to Normandy to visit battlefield sites. That's what British tourists do. But no, in fact, it's two Oklahoma truck drivers who are going to Abbeville tomorrow. And everyone knows there are traffic holdups on Route 7 on the way from Paris, Texas to Abbeville, Louisiana. So that shows you the ways in which the context can determine the language. There's no way in which a machine can know about what might be the right sorts of context in order to make the right sorts of contributions in the right sorts of conversation. All right, then there's the setting. Different settings call for different kinds of language. Then there's I think I mentioned that one. Then there's prosody, which means sometimes you speak very loudly and then you sort of whisper and mutter and moan and so forth. And then there's dialogue economy, where you are very short and quick because you don't want to waste time, or when you are using formulae, which people often do, also because you don't want to waste time, or because you want to bring in all kinds of contextual associations. So there are huge numbers of dialogue horizon factors which go hand in hand with, will you marry me? And that too probably would never occur in a Stasi interrogation, but still, you never know. Then there's turn taking, which is part of the whole dynamic character of the dialogue. The dialogue occurs over time, and there are contributions from people with different roles. So now I have the speaker role. In a while, you will all have the speaker role, and I will have the interpreter role. And we should take turns, but of course, people don't always take turns. In fact, taking turns is relatively rare, in the sense that you have a clean dialogue where there's always a speaker and then and then another speaker and then the first speaker again and then the other speaker. Most dialogues involve all kinds of interruptions and people speaking at the same time. And now while you are engaging in the turn taking, your intentions are developing. So you started the dialogue for a certain reason, and it's going to be very hard to build the machine so that it will have the same kinds of reasons that we have when we engage in dialogue. We want to find out where we're going out for dinner, for instance. So we say, where shall we go for dinner? And then the other person will respond, and that will change our intention correspondingly. Their intention will then also change. So we have a constant loop of it changing intentions until we finally agree on where we're going to go for dinner. And in every case, the context may be modified. The horizons will certainly be modified. But the dialogue itself may become part of the horizon. For instance, when I say this argument about where we're going for dinner. So I say this in the course of a dialogue about where we're going to dinner. And I say, this dialogue about where we're going for dinner is getting very boring. And so now the dialogue is about the dialogue itself. And again, the machine is going to have to deal with that kind of logically quite tricky phenomenon. All right, so this is an example of real dialogue. It's about Anne, who's talking about why she has to buy 100 pairs of shoes a day. And all of these are cases where more than one person is speaking at the same time. And a machine could not cope with this kind of thing. And one of the reasons why computer machines sound very unhuman is because they don't allow interruptions. All right, so the human language system is a complex system. In fact, even a dialogue is a complex system made out of at least two complex systems at the next level, namely yours and mine. And so we have a chapter, this is the main chapter in the book, about the mathematics of complex systems and the role they play. And the reason why we have so many elaborately engineered devices but they relate to a very restricted domain, namely the domain where we can do what we call extended Newtonian mathematics. We can think of this as just differential calculus in order to predict the behavior of those artifacts. We can only build artifacts where we can predict the behavior of the artifacts using mathematics. And so we can't build artifacts which will be complex systems, because we can't use mathematics, Newtonian mathematics, for those kinds of systems. And so these are some examples of complex systems. Every organism is a complex system. The Singapore traffic system is a complex system. Stock exchanges are complex systems. The global climate is a complex system, and the human language system is a complex system. And we give the properties of complex systems, and we give examples of simple systems in the book. All right. And now let's suppose that we are going to take the challenge, and there are hundreds of very clever people who are taking this challenge, building a machine, namely a neural network machine or an artificial intelligence machine that can master human language. There are hundreds of very clever people doing that. And these are the ways that they want to do it. And in the book, we show that they all fail. Why they all fail, indeed. All right, so it won't happen. There will never be machine mastery of human intelligence. That's what the book says. And this is the reason. We have no mathematical models for complex systems, and human language is a complex system. So, and the various different kinds of stochastic AI which are intending to solve this problem don't solve the problem. I won't go into details here about that. This is the chapter about complex systems applied to language. And then these are the three final chapters, which are the only ones you're interested in. Specifically, you're interested in this one. We're still working on the title, so that isn't a very good title. It's better than what we had before. All right, so this is America's highest paid female CEO, Martina Rotblatt, or I don't know how she pronounces her word in Californian, her name. And she talks about transgenderism. Transgenderism, she says, is being trapped in the wrong body. And what she wants is freedom of gender, so that we're not limited by our sexual anatomy and so forth. But she goes further than that. So instead of just advocating transgenderism, she also advocates transhumanism. And transhumanism would be being trapped in a body at all. So she is trapped in the wrong body because she's trapped in a body, and all bodies are the wrong body. That's the idea. Now, in order to understand what's going on here, we need to think about what it is, the identity which survives when you are no longer trapped in the wrong body. And this turns out to be a very, very difficult topic, but in order to bring some control over the topic, we're going to consider the following thought experiment. You have just been involved in a terrible traffic accident. Many of your limbs are no longer serviceable, and the surgeon bends over you and says, "Do you want me to save your life?" And the question is, under certain circumstances, you might very well say no. So if he tells you that it will only give you 5 minutes more life, you'll probably say no. If he tells you that you will be in a wheelchair and can never speak or see or communicate or hear, you'd probably say no. So the question is, what would it be required for you to have to count as surviving so that you would say yes? And this may be not just surviving in the sense that the surgeon will repair your own body. It may be surviving in the sense that your brain is transplanted to another body, or indeed, and that's what we're going to be talking about very soon, It may be that you're surviving in the sense that your brain contents are transplanted into somebody else's body or into no body at all. What would make the transplant worthwhile? What would have to survive? Well, your identity. What is your identity? Well, I'm going to suggest that it's this. It's a complex pattern of dispositions, like your dispositions to speak English, the capabilities. They are dispositions in which you have an interest in their realization. These result from your genes, but also from environmental influences. So your neurophysiology gives you all kinds of dispositions. And you want to keep the important dispositions. So the ephemeral ones, you don't mind if you lose those because you can bring them back. But the lasting ones, the fact that you can speak English or some other language, that you can remember faces, that you can tell jokes and so on, you want to keep those. Above all, you want to keep your capability to have conscious experiences. And that is non-trivial. So it could be that you could still tell jokes. Zombies could tell jokes for all I know. But you, if you want to survive, are going to want to keep the capability to have conscious experiences. All right. So I'm repeating myself now. The only thing new here is how could you ever know that it will do so? So in other words, if I tell you I'm going to transplant your brain into this thing here, and you'll still be conscious and you'll still have all your memories, how will you ever know that you will still be conscious? How you can never know. Anyway, so John's identity or Martina's identity is a complex of dispositions, and the material basis of that complex of dispositions is the what we will call the neural substrate. It's John's brain, perhaps including also other neurologically relevant parts of John's body. And whether we want to keep John's mental disorders, so John may be very hyper or something, that's a question that we can consider. That would certainly be a long-standing genetically based disposition of John, but that's not relevant here. All right, so this is the ontological picture. We have John's neural substrate, which is the material basis of John's identity, which is realized. John's identity is a set of capabilities, including linguistic capabilities, which are realized when John speaks to Mary. And we don't really need to talk about all the other things because they are already dealt with one way or another. The only thing we need to say is that there is an inheres-in relation. So the dispositions that we have inhere in some brain or some bodily structure, the bearer of our dispositions. All right, now this is what it happens at time t. John is speaking to Mary at time t1, and at that time, John's identity has as its material substrate John's brain, John's body, something that we can see and feel and give food to. But then at time t2, John is speaking to Mary again. We won't think too carefully about Mary for the moment. And now John has as the substrate of his identity something digital, some locations on a hard drive in the cloud somewhere. So that's the scenario. So John's identity first has a material basis, which is his neural substrate, and then a digital substrate. So there are two kinds of material basis. This is all very familiar. I just have some colored pictures. The question is, how do we get from one to the other? Well, we put John to sleep and extract the contents of his brain and put the contents into the cloud. So Martina tells us how this will happen. So the idea is something like this. John's identity inheres in John's digital substrate, she says, in just the same way that it hears in his neural substrate, because the same pattern is going to exist in here and in here, a quality pattern. We'll see how this works in a minute. So, transgenderism and transhumanism both start with the idea that there is some identity, and we're still going to argue that's a complex of dispositions. It changes over time. You become more mature, and you want to preserve your identity, but in another body. Now, how does this work for transgenderism? Well, actually, it doesn't work, because Martina still has the same body. She still has the same identity. So transgenderism is not ontologically a difficult problem. It's just a surgically difficult problem. But that problem has been solved. There is no ontological problem to solve. What about the transhumanist case? Well, that's much more difficult. So what is this thing that has the identity? Well, this is Martina's account. In 2006, there are things called beams, which are a generalization or a new version of the Dawkins idea of a meme. She calls them beams. And I don't really want to read this out, but basically they're patterns. Each beam is comprised of a large number of beamiotides, much like gene-based pairs. So if you have a language of patterns relating to mannerisms, personality, feelings, all the bits which make up these things, then these will be beamiotides, and you have a beam which is the pattern of all your beamiotides. And now, because it's a pattern, it can be a pattern in neural stuff, in bodily, organic, biological stuff, or it can be a pattern in digital stuff. Cryonics is based, she says, on beam revival. And having common beams, that's going to be, she thinks, a new basis for species definition. So in future, there will be two types of beams: human beams, which she calls hubems, I think, and digital beams. I don't know what she calls that. In fact, I don't think she uses this terminology anymore. It's just so beautiful. There'll be human beams and digital beams, and they can have babies. Anyway, so this is how it works. Beams would be captured through your life. So you would have a bouquet of nanowires threaded through your brain, which will monitor all the activities of all your brain cells. And then the output of these brain cells can be retrieved later and uploaded as beams. And then to make those beams conscious, you would need what she calls mindware, which is a very, very powerful kind of software which turns beams into consciousness. And so when we have beams, when we have machines with this human level of intelligence, we will be able to beam ourselves into cyberspace. I think that's why she chose the word beam, just for that pun. And then, of course, the problem is, how will we know that the beamons are conscious? Well, her answer is, consciousness is like pornography. We'll know it when we see it. That's her answer. Now, the first answer I have is that the idea of this bouquet of nanowires is nonsense. And Jobs can explain in great detail why it's nonsense. And then the other answer I have is, you go first. So I'll wait and see how it works out for you before I start recording all the activities of all the cells in my brain. All right, so go back to transhumanism now. The idea is that your pattern, exactly similar pattern of dispositions, will remain, and it believes it's you, and it will be conscious, but that's the part which is hard to prove. Something else that will need to make survival worthwhile is that thing which survives will need to be able to converse in the machine and probably with other machines. In principle, machine humans can converse also with flesh humans, but we certainly want to be able to converse with something. And we know that the Turing test has not yet been passed by any machine, and Jobst and I believe that we have a very powerful argument why it will never be passed by a machine, so that human conversation between or involving machines is in fact impossible. But surely this is something that we would want. All right, so that's the Turing test. The Turing test measures the ability to conduct credible dialogues with human beings and with other B-mans. All right, now Faraday's maxim is, so this might all be possible because of Faraday's maxim. Nothing is too wonderful to be true if it's be consistent with the laws of nature. And we'll say the laws of physics just to be clear about what we're doing here. So it could be that the planet Earth will be swallowed by a black hole tomorrow. That the planet Earth being swallowed by a black hole tomorrow is consistent with the laws of physics. Things are being swallowed by black holes all the time. The problem is getting there. How do we get to that happening tomorrow? That's impossible, because it's going to take at least a very long time before the planet Earth gets near a black hole. And to be swallowed by a black hole, you have to be near it. So it's not just the laws of physics governing the state of affairs that you're interested in, which you need to consider. It's the process of getting there. And so even if Martina's ideas about beam patterns being uploadable from brains so that the pattern of your brain and so on, even if that's consistent with the laws of physics, the big problem is, can it be brought about in a process which is consistent with the laws of physics? So if putting all of these tubes in your brain so that every single cell of your brain is such that every single event in that cell is being recorded in real time, if that's physically impossible, which it is, and if that's the only way in which you can get the beam thing to work, then Faraday's maxim will tell, the extended Faraday maxim will tell us that it's impossible. Even if it's wonderful, it's still impossible. All right, so it's impossible because we can't get there, independently of whether there's something there to be got. We've seen all of this. Now we see the recipe in, so Martina, to be honest, is a great mind and a great entrepreneur, but much of what she writes is not yet science. Now, Nick Bostrom is a great author, and much of what he writes looks much more like science than what Martina writes. And I recommend this book to anybody who is interested in this sort of thing. So we're just going to go through, I don't have much time left. We're just going to go through a couple of things which Nick, I just call him Bostrom, that's why I'd forgotten his name, which Nick describes achieving. And so whole brain emulation. So one of the ways in which we will achieve digital immortality is by creating superintelligence so that we can then use the bemiotides in order to reconstitute an identity in the cloud. So how do we get superintelligence? Well, one way is to create whole brain emulation. In other words, we take a particularly intelligent brain, like Nick's brain, and we emulate it digitally. And there are 3 steps. We scan it, we translate the scans into a scan interpretation, which will be a software model of Nick's brain, and then we create a simulation in a computer so that now we can run the simulation, and that will be Nick's brain counterpart alive, or anyway, continuing on. So step 1 is scanning. Now, you can't do that for various reasons. First of all, in order to scan a brain, you need to fixate the brain material so that you can apply microscopic imaging, but that kills the cells. And in order to get to the second and third steps, we need to understand how the cells in the brain are functioning. And if we kill them, we lose all the information that we need in order to capture the dynamics of molecular interaction. So we can't even kill the person in order to get the data, because that would kill the cells. And I just said that. So maybe we can have some kind of magical MRI machine which could track the activities of Nick's brain in real time, and we can't. And that's because of resolution problems. So MRI techniques go down to about 20 microns and 50 pictures, 50 images per second. But the brain mechanisms that we need to study involve events down to the level of a few atoms. We can understand the biology of those events, as it were, but because they're down to the level of a few atoms, we need much more high resolution MRI, and that would mean resolution at 3 orders of magnitude smaller and at 3 orders of magnitude faster, and we just can't get that technically. So we can't get the data, but let's suppose we get the data from step 1, and now we have to translate it into computer code. So that means build a model which would capture all the data that we acquired in step 1. All the information about all the neurotransmitters in all the synaptic clefts, and measures of all the ion fluxes and all the chemical and all the other signaling events going on inside Nick's brain. Now, we still, even if we had data about all of those things, I think 10 to the 40th data points we're talking about now, we still couldn't model Nick's mental experiences. And the reason is that they don't just depend upon what's going on in the cells, they also depend upon the molecular configuration of those cells. And this molecular configuration depends on the entire genome that the cell carries in its nucleus, which is already quite a big object, the epigenetic chemical modifications of this genome, which are different from one person to the next, and then the molecular configuration of the non-nuclear parts of the cell, which is hundreds of thousands of molecules, which are again shaped by the experiences of the organism since conception. So that it's very important to get those molecular configurations right. And we can't have any access to that information via imaging anyway. There's just no way in which we can have sufficient resolution to get into the interior structure of the cell in that way. And that interior of the structure of the cell is changing all the time. And so we need to capture the changes, not just the snapshot at a time, in order to work out, get a model of how the cell is working, because you need that in order to reanimate the cell in the cloud. And we can't do that. All right, so step 2 also fails. Even if we could get 10 to the 15th molecules at a resolution of 10 to the 21 data points per second, we still couldn't emulate the behavior of the relevant collection of cells, because we would have no mathematical model, because it's a complex system. All right, step 3, simulation. So we actually, in the book, we don't discuss step 3 because it depends on successfully realizing steps 1 and 2. Step 1 is impossible, and step 2 is exactly 24.3 orders of magnitude more impossible, and I'll explain where that number comes from in a minute. All right, so quantum computers, some people think, will solve all our problems, but no, they're just way faster than classical computers. They're still Turing machines, so they still place this great limit on mathematical models. So what about biological enhancements of a brain? So Nick thinks that if we could carry out embryo selection very, very radically, we could rapidly increase the IQ of the babies. And and he says, we can select more intelligent individuals through embryo selection, which can yield an increase, and this is where the 24.3 comes from, to 24.3 IQ points. And to get that increase, we would need to select 999 out of every 1,000, sorry, we would need to discard 999 out of every 1,000 embryos in one generation. And if we keep doing that over several generations, we could reach quite large numbers of IQ improvement. And we don't need to have 1,000 couples allowing just one of them to select their embryo. We can have just one couple, and we do anyway. I won't go into that. All right. The problem is that intelligence is a complex trait, which means that we don't know which gene loci bring it about, and we have to identify those gene loci in order to make the changes which will lead to the corresponding biological enhancements. And the complex traits then arise from interactions between these gene loci and between those other factors I mentioned earlier, which involve trillions of molecules at both cellular and molecular and intercellular levels. And there are some of these interactions, even if we had the data, are just not computable. Therefore, I guess the therefore is pretty clear. We have no mechanism for measuring the differences and no idea about how we might integrate them in order to decide which parts of the set of gene loci we should modify and how. And we would, if we tried to do it, we'd probably end up doing damage. I won't talk about that. So this is a final problem, which says that, well, no, I won't talk about that. I'll just stop. All right, that's the end. I ended very badly, but I made it with 1 minute to spare. And now I will stop sharing. And it'd be funny if I'd been muted the whole way. I'm not muted anymore. So Eric, you can be the chairman. So you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. I guess if you have a question, either raise your hand or put it up, or just unmute and start talking if no one has any. All right, I saw James Delaney first. Jim?
Oh, wow, first question. So Barry, thanks for the talk. It's really, really interesting, and a lot of, like always, a lot of the math goes over my head. So I was kind of interested when you went back to like the example of John. It seems like you're saying, look, just the limitations in place, we'll never be able to make this happen. But it seemed like you were saying, but if we did make that happen, then in fact John would be in this. That would be John. He would be that digital, embodiment, whatever it was, would be John. But I guess like I'm wondering, would you say that's true? Because if you do, I'd be kind of surprised at that. Like I would have thought you would go more kind of along the lines of like Parfit and say something like, well, that would be something that's maybe psychologically continuous, John, but it's not identical to John. Maybe identity isn't what matters. So I guess I'm just wondering what your view is on identity. Like, were this actually possible? What's the identity relationship?
Yeah, so I was rather taking Nick and Martina at their respective words. So they take it seriously. I'm not sure about Nick about digital immortality, but certainly Martina takes it seriously. I'm willing to take it seriously for about 5 minutes, but then Parfit problems get in the way. So it does work for about 5 minutes if you think about it. So that if you can put the human being to sleep, and then it wakes up and is conscious and remembers what happened yesterday, and I guess all his friends would recognize him, that part would be difficult. But you could take care of that if you have enough people making the move at the same time. And if you have good video, so I don't know if people have all watched at least a few minutes of this new Upload TV program. Uploading, is it called? So it describes somebody who uploads his brain and lands in this wonderful elite hotel with a lake and very attractive people all around him, and he feels really good. And but none of it's real. Occasionally there are glitches in the software. Suddenly the trees turn into random dots. It's somewhat funny, but I couldn't stand it for more than a few minutes.
Thanks for.
John?
I was just lying by gesture. Don't have a question.
I see. Interesting.
No, actually, I do have a question.
And I didn't spot it either, but then you weren't really serious either. It wasn't a serious lie.
No, I could, yeah. Just adjust. I was curious about the extended mind hypothesis and whether that kind of idea, whether that just complicates what you're saying or makes the problem even more difficult.
I think it makes the problem even more difficult, actually. I haven't thought very much about this. I think we're going to have to look at it at least briefly in the book, but we haven't done any serious work on it yet. We mentioned Andy Clark at one point.
Yeah, I think it would complicate it.
Yeah, it would complicate the whole digital immortality business, but that is, remember, not by any means the central theme of the book. The central theme of the book is that artificial intelligence, whereby intelligence you mean something which would be roughly similar to or better than the human intelligence, is impossible, which is to some people in the AI and science fiction worlds very troublesome. Many people will, if we're right and if we succeed in convincing people, then many people now will be revealed to have been wasting their lives. Many very clever people also. It's quite exciting.
If I may comment on the extended mind thing, I think it doesn't really change much because the nature of our mind-body continuum is a complex system anyhow, and actually we cannot even mathematically model the warm Caenorhabditis elegans mathematically. So I'm not so concerned whether the mind is extended or not. It's anyhow completely out of scope of mathematical modeling.
So he meant C. elegans for short.
Okay.
It's a very, very small organism.
Stephen?
Hey, sorry, Barry, thank you. I'm one of those people you might know who's wasting his life on AGI.
Ah.
So I
Well,
guess
we have to see. It could be that the book is published and then somebody finds a very simple mistake.
Yeah, or I guess one simple
so.
refutation was that if they made AGI within shortly after the book
well,
was published.
I'm not holding my breath.
No, I wouldn't either.
That's an argument. That's the I'm not holding my breath argument.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'll concede that one. I'm not going to hold my breath either. But I do want to. I guess I want to I'm sure you've thought. I know you well enough to know you've thought about this. But I want to give you an opportunity to expand on it. Like you say, there's no way a machine could do something like handle the complexities of a dialogue. And yet, I guess I would have thought that you had the view that we're machines or that we're purely material. So, and maybe I haven't met your co-author, but maybe he shares that view as well. Do you not share that view, or how is it that we can do it?
Because we're organisms. But I'll let Jobst answer that question. I would be interested to hear his reaction.
Okay, so the difference between, basically you're right that the human being is of course made of matter, and the four fundamental forces of physics govern the entire working of this piece of matter. So therefore you could think that it's just another machine. However, the difference between an organism like a human being or any other living organism and a machine is that the human being is a complex system, whereas a machine that we build is not a complex system, but is a system built using Newtonian or extended Newtonian mathematics. So that's a fundamental difference, because every system that we build ourselves, we can model with mathematical models. We can write them down, or we can create them automatically using machine learning. But for complex systems, it can be proven that we cannot create such models. And therefore, yes, we are machines, but we are complex system type machines for which there are no mathematics available.
I would actually not formulate it in that way. I would say we are organisms. We have some functioning parts which are functioning in a way which is rather similar to a machine, but I wouldn't use the word machine in that context. I agree with what he said though.
Can I have a follow-up, or I don't know what the...
Yes, you can have a follow-up. I apparently make the rules about that kind of thing.
I mean, I actually like, I have to say, although I am an AGI advocate, I've been thrown into doubt some, partly by things like GPT-3. I'm inclined to say, even if that thing passes, even if GPT-4 passes a Turing test on even a Stasi Turing test, which it's starting to look like they might, I still would say like, yeah, but there's not understanding there. And I have to say, like I read, Terence Deacon makes a pretty good case that there's an essential difference between organisms and machines. And I guess I'd have to know more details about the why. So it sounds like by machine, you mean something very specific about what kind of equations we could write down, and the kinds of equations we could write down even for like, trillion node neural nets would still not be sufficient to do the kind of computation that it seems we humans can do. Is that right?
Yeah, basically such a neural network is also, it's just a differentiable equation. So it has it's just a very long Newtonian calculus type of equation.
Well, of course, but it can't actually be calculated in time. So it's got to be approximated in all sorts of crazy ways. Isn't that just what we do?
Yeah, we actually, what we do is actually find local optima in this equation, but
just like gradient descent.
But this is not an adequate model of complex system. But we can't do this here now. It's really a follow-up thing to discuss with you all the details of why complex systems are not modelable by such models. But there is no such fundamental difference between a model that is generated via neural network and a model that we explicitly create.
Well, I look forward to that part of the book. I'll look forward to it. Thank you.
All right, Neil, did you have a question? You're muted, Neil.
I didn't. I mean, I was going to ask something similar to what Steve Peterson did, but I was just wondering if Barry and Jobst think that infinite amounts of data are needed to train us, so to speak. And I think it was a thought kind of exactly along the lines that spurred Steve's question. So no, I don't.
Okay, in that case, we'll go to Steve.
All right, so I enjoyed the talk. My question is, could God create a machine that can do what we did, that could pass all the Turing tests and things like that, so that the issue of complexity could be put aside? In particular, could he create a silicon or metal-based machine that could pass any of the relevant tests? So I'm guessing you're wondering why, in theory, understanding or whatever the psychology is needed has to be confined to a biological system.
Jobst, do you want to answer this one?
About God. Well, I would rather, I can combine it by answering Benjamin's question. So basically, let's start with that. So you don't need infinite amount of data to train organisms because of evolution. Because evolution basically, over a very long period of time, created what we call drive or drivenness of organisms, which is basically what makes them want to reproduce and survive. And this drive or drivenness that organisms have solves problems. And we don't know how this is coming about, but surely not infinite amounts of data in evolution were needed to achieve this, but a lot of data, but not infinite amounts. And so this would also be my answer to Stephen. So if God created the universe and time and everything, then he also created the situation which gave rise to this evolution, of which we are a product. That's the only answer I can give. Yeah.
So, Eric, can I follow up? So, I'm not sure I see the problem in I can see the practical problem, but I'm not sure I see the problem in principle. And why couldn't we have silicon-based machines that think just as well as we do? It's just right now we can't produce them. That is what I know. Barry has a stronger claim that, in fact, that there's no possible world in which silicon machines can do exactly what we do. But I'm lacking in the argument as to why, from the limitations on data in the actual world, we can't go to possible worlds and have silicon-based machines that can do exactly what we can do, perhaps do what we do better.
So I think I would go back to Faraday's principle, the extended version of the Faraday's principle. Let's suppose you're right, that it doesn't break any laws of physics to imagine a silicon-based machine that would be equally as or more intelligent than a human being. The interesting question is, how do we get there? And but waving our arms and saying possible worlds sounds very David Lewisian, but that doesn't mean it's true. I want to know how you're going to do it. And Nick Bostrom wrote this wonderful book, absolutely amazing book. You'll never know. You never know when you're reading it whether you're reading science fiction or not. And he put forward a whole series of recipes and strategies for achieving this super intelligence, and every single one of them is we think unrealizable. Some of them gigantically so, embarrassingly so, and partly because he didn't know enough biology. Go ahead.
I think the strong reply to you, Stephen, and is that, this is a point, but the strong point, because you could always say yes, but he didn't think hard enough, and in the future it might be possible. My conviction is that there are hard limits to what we can model mathematically, this is basically, we can only model what can be expressed with Newtonian mathematics, or the extended Newtonian mathematics which we have today. But we have there is no way that we can model, for example, exactly with differential equations, which is the most powerful tool of mathematics, more than a few variables. And even to do that, even if we have only a few variables, under many circumstances, we cannot create an adequate model. So we need the space of modelable problems is quite small, and the space of problems we cannot solve by modeling is gigantic. And I think that just because we live in a technical world in which we have built a lot of devices that work pretty well, like airplanes and radios and computers, we are under the impression that we can model a lot. But in reality, the part of the world that we can model mathematically is astonishingly small. And if you ever created mathematical models yourself, then you're aware of their extreme limitations. So interestingly, when I discuss with physicists or mathematicians, they always will, quite after a short while, say, yes, you're right, I can't model even 10 variables, but the brain has millions or trillions of interacting variables in nanoseconds of speed. And so I think that the tool mathematics that we have, to which we're capable, is unable to create models that we can use to define what the silicon intelligence should do. But the silicon intelligence can only execute models. So if we have no way of modeling this, then how could we make the silicon machine execute it?
So just one last response, and I'll stop. I see what you're saying about our limited ability currently to model things, but as we increasingly genetically tinker with the human being, we're going to improve human ability. And when human ability improves, and then they use the increase in human ability to further better design the human being, we're probably going to see a fairly sharp rise in IQ. I mean, enormous rises in IQ over time. And with enormous rises of IQ, I wonder why we should think our modeling ability is going to be so limited. I mean, imagine just three generations of computer-enhanced human beings further enhancing human beings with greater computer enhancement. Why wouldn't sort of multiple rounds of feedback loops with IQs of 200 and 250 produce mathematical abilities, far beyond what we can anticipate now?
The answer is quite simple. Or do you want to give the answer, Barry?
No, go ahead.
Basically, you're saying, I just need A to get A. Yeah, because to get the you're saying I need just to get human superintelligence to make super intelligent machines. But to make super intelligent humans, you would need to engineer humans to become more intelligent. And to do that, you would need to understand which genetic traits determine intelligence. Now, since actually it's a very new result from 2019, that the body height, how do you pronounce it, Barry?
Height.
Body height is determined by 80 to 90,000 genetic loci. And it's quite a simple trait. And intelligence is probably an omnigenetic trait. So actually we can't model how intelligence comes about. If we can't model it, we can't genetically engineer it. So we're stuck with the same problem like with silicon intelligence. We don't know how to modify human intelligence by engineering because we don't know how it comes about. Now, if you look at the Mendelian property, like, for example, inherited disease, simple Mendelian inherited disease like factor VIII deficiency. Now, we know how this inherited, it's one genetic locus. We know the genetic code that the natural allele has as opposed to the disease allele. We have the technology to actually modify a human embryo to change the sequence of this single genetic locus, and then it would be healed. It would then grow up to become a child that doesn't have factor VIII deficiency anymore. But this is only true for Mendelian diseases. But complex traits such as intelligence, we don't know what we would have to modify. As to enhancing the human brain by putting in computer components, there is no way how to attach a computer to the human brain. And I don't have the time to explain this now, but actually we don't know how we could manipulate the afferent or afferent systems of the brain by adding machinery. So both possibilities, the genetic modification possibility, but also the cyber modification possibility cannot be realized because we have no models that we need to engineer this. And remember, everything we engineer is based on a mathematical model.
Okay, Catherine?
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk, and I hope you guys can hear me. Sometimes my internet is a little choppy. So I was wondering if some of the problems with human-designed artificial intelligence could be solved with machine learning. And in particular, I'm thinking about these chatbots that are supposed to pass the Turing test and then fail dramatically when they say things like camels have between 2 and 4 legs. And I was wondering if we were actually too easy on these chatbots. And if we created something for them, something more like the evolutionary process, we'd be able to see a faster development. So I'm imagining something like, as soon as the chatbot says that camels have between 2 and 4 legs, you kill that. And that is actually taken into account, and the chatbot never gives that answer again in any future chat. So we'd have a much more dramatic, possibly much more efficient way for the chatbot to learn language quickly. I'm kind of curious whether that's been done or whether anyone's trying to emulate more or less natural selection within machine learning.
So it has been done, and it's quite a big industry. And if I'm right about this, it's called reinforcement learning.
Correct.
That was a correct?
Yes.
Good. So reinforcement learning works amazingly well. So the game of Go is much more complicated than the game of chess, but they cracked the game of Go by using reinforcement learning. And what they did was they found a way of scoring moves in the game of Go, which is rather simple to do, and then they had the computer play Go with itself billions of times, following the strategy that Catherine just described, and they ended up with a function that beats human beings at playing Go and impresses Go masters who say that they're inventing entire new strategies. Now, but you can do that with games because you have a scoring system which can be applied by the computer. And that means the computer can play and play and play without any problem because it's applying the score itself. But when you're talking about chatbot activities, there is no automatic scoring system that you need a human being to say which moves in the conversation are going to be counted as being good moves and which are going to be counted as bad moves. And you can't do that. We can't do it now. If we tried to give scores to each of our contributions to this discussion, we wouldn't be able to do it in any kind of coherent way. And that's why you can't use reinforcement learning to solve the dialogue problem, because you can't score dialogues. Try it next time you have a dialogue with your partner. See how it goes.
Right, David?
Hi, Barry. Oops. There's many transhumanist visions that we're either identical to these beings that are more resilient, or they have what matters to us, and even if we're not identical to them. And so they all want to, survive our body wearing down. And so I have a question about what sort of impossibility these different versions. So you have a mathematical argument that we won't be able to duplicate our abilities in a computer. And then I think that also will rule out this hope for functional inorganic equivalent. Like if we're replacing all our organic matter over time, but we think we survive because it's functionally the same and our brain cells are made of different things, we won't be able to replace it with a more resilient material, because then we would have to know the dispositions of the human brain and language before we know that we have some metal or something that's more resilient that wouldn't wear down like the human brain. And so you would have a mathematical argument, we wouldn't know that, or it would just have to be amazing good luck that we found some material with the same dispositions. And you think it's hopeless to be able to model those linguistic dispositions. Then there's a type of, I wasn't sure about the scanning, whether that was just a technological impossibility presently, or there was, or it was somehow unlawful. The model I have in mind is, I don't know anything about the mechanics of, say, an alarm clock, but I could look inside and get similar pieces, put it together, and make a clock without knowing any of the laws. So if we could scan the brain and make something out of the same material that was equivalent, we could then survive or have something that wasn't us, but related to us in the right way that might matter to us. Is this scanning going to be unlawful or just technologically impossible, or we can't get to that level of resolution? I mean, what is the impossibility of getting the information without knowing anything about making a computer model of it, but just like looking at all the neurons? If you got a perfect duplicate, you would get the dispositions for free. If we could scan the brain and make one, just a time slice, you wouldn't even need to know its dispositions. You'll get them for free if you make it of the same stuff. So you wouldn't need all this ability to model. It wouldn't be the mathematical objection. So is the scanning just technologically unlikely, far-fetched, too many things, too small? Or is there some other sort of more of a impossibility that won't be surmounted by any?
So I'm going to ask Jobs to answer the resolution question, but then I may have an answer of my own when he's dealt with that.
So let's look. Neurons are living cells, and so their function relies on their being alive. So let's look at the simplest living cells that we know of, archaeobacteria or archaea. Sorry, my English is not so good in such technical terms. These are the most primitive bacteria we know. They have small genomes of only 15,000 genes, and they have the lowest diversity in terms of proteins and other functional molecules inside them. However, we don't know at all. We can actually read the exact chemical nature of all of them, because we can take them in cell culture and so on. And nevertheless, we cannot create such a cell via chemical synthesis. Mm-hmm. We just don't know how. And all we can do is take out its DNA and put in the DNA of another bacterium in it. And then actually this new bacterium will, like in cloning, obtain some properties of the bacterium from which the DNA was taken, but we can't create life out of matter. But I'm convinced that the functions of the neurons require the state of living, because many of the molecules or actually most of the machinery that happens inside them requires ATP, because, for example, phosphorylation cannot work without ATP. But then we would have to know how to create a machinery that can synthesize ATP out of matter. But we have no idea about this.
I'm just asking, can we get the information we need to do an organic duplicate? Could we make a duplicate of a cell?
No, even not
a functional equivalent inorganic duplicate, but just made out of the same stuff.
No, that's what I'm saying. We can't even do this for the most primitive organism we know, for the most primitive living organism we know. And I think it's for systematic reasons. Okay. Because we are not able to model it properly. So we can only make what we can model. And now it's Barry's turn.
So could we do it with viruses?
Oh yes, we can. Viruses are not living organisms. They are just infectious structures. And we are already able to create synthetic viruses, and we will become better.
So you actually answered the question the way I was going to answer yours. What you didn't answer was the resolution question. Can we have MRI with 3 orders of magnitude finer resolution?
I'm not a physicist, but I think that it's impossible because we can't get to this level of detection. The problem, I believe, but I'm not able to prove this. I would have to ask, especially, so spatially, it's very difficult, but in terms of time, I think it's impossible. I think there are hard limits with a resolution in time. I think we are getting to quantum theory problems here, that it's so small and so fast that probably we would have to measure almost the equivalent of locations of electrons. And this has been shown by Schrödinger already 100 years ago that it's impossible. So I believe there are very hard physical limits, but so that prevent us from getting to this level of resolution. But I'm not absolutely certain. And sorry, Barry, I didn't want to steal your answer.
No, that's fine.
So there's no analog of me taking apart a mechanical thing and just duplicating the parts without knowing the laws that govern them. I just replace one gear with a gear that looks like it. There's no organic analog of that. We couldn't look at a cell without being able to model it, just create something that was a perfect organic duplicate of that. That's impossible.
It seems so. Even if we look at all the experiments, I mean, since 1980, people are trying to do this with these primitive bacteria. Mm-hmm. Because since the end of the 80s, we have almost entire genomes of them for a long time. And we can also now chemically completely X-ray them, so to speak, at a chemical level, really. Mm-hmm. But we can't, this trick with the clock, it's not applicable to living organisms, obviously.
Okay.
All right, are there any other questions? All right, Steve.
more question. I realize this is consistent with your talk, but I'm wondering, could we substantially improve human ability just through selective breeding? I know this is consistent with your claim that we can't do artificial intelligence, but I wonder in the same way that we've selectively bred for dogs and other things to produce animals which are incredibly different and far more capable at certain tasks than the animals from which they derived, the Asian wolf, for example. Would that be a mechanism by which we could get human beings that are substantially improved above current human beings, even if this is perfectly consistent with your theory and your argument?
So I think, first of all, we don't know. So we don't know whether IQ can be enlarged without limit. We don't know how to do the appropriate gene manipulations or how to do mass embryo selection without facing either biological, chemical problems or ethical problems. So we don't know. Jobs and I normally know everything, but
the problem I see is that to do the selection, we would have to have a genotype phenotype, very good genotype phenotype correlation or almost prediction. Yeah, so it means we would have to measure genetic loci and then be able to predict with high accuracy whether this embryo of which we are measuring DNA will become intelligent. And it seems that this is impossible. This is actually something always hoped for, or not hoped for, but suspected, but which has now very recently confirmed. And Stephen, we can send you a very interesting paper that was published last year about omnigenetics, which is a new theory that is derived from this insight into the height problem, that complex traits are encoded by so many genetic loci that it's impossible to use them for predictions. And so then we have nothing to select by, right?
Because why can't we just pick people who have 1550 SATs or higher and have them reproduce? I mean, that's what they do, and that's what they're trying to do in places like Singapore.
You can only do that in Fredonia.
No, but actually,
there's no one in Fredonia scores 1550. I don't know, maybe Neil scored that, but no one else beside Neil.
If you do that, because meiotic recombination will occur, and so very clever couples can have stupid children. That's actually, I mean, Kant's parents were the opposite. They were not so intelligent, but Immanuel Kant was pretty clever, even if you don't like him. Yeah. So that's meiotic recombination at work.
If I could add, though, wouldn't you still be able to see population trends drift in a certain direction if you were just watching the gene pool go in selecting for the high performers? And by high performers, it doesn't just have to be solely, SAT scores. It can be a bunch of other important intellectual abilities like high emotional social sensitivities and things like that. Just generally high performers all across the board. Wouldn't you see the genetic pool be able to drift on like an average, even if you're going to find recombination and other oddities in that pool?
I think that's what we have at the moment. Probably you would find that in Silicon Valley, the IQ is going up little by little, but in the whole country, it's going down. In the whole world, it's going down.
I think that Europe has probably since the 8th or 9th century, since monogamism or how do you say in English? Monogamy.
Monogamy.
Yeah, so it has been fully enforced, I think, since the 6th century. And this in combination with selective marriage has basically created genetically the pool from which the Enlightenment was generated. So I think that historically we've been observing such a process that you describe. So it's possible, but there seems to be an upper limit to it.
Right, I actually have a question. So this gets I guess, is a question about why we can't model the human brain. So even if we accept the fact that we'll never be able to get the data, what's stopping us from saying, okay, well, let's, get some standard kind of supercomputer, write a program to, model a neuron, just like one single neuron, like what it does, and then string a bunch of these simulations together to sort of simulate a working brain. We might not even know or have the data to go in and like figure out exactly how our neurons are working, but wouldn't, at least in principle, we'd be able to kind of mess around with it, play around with it enough to, get to the point where even if we haven't mimicked our brains exactly, we're still mimicking something with intelligence. I mean, maybe we don't have the technological capabilities to do this now, but would that be a way to get around the modeling problem?
Only if you believe in magic. So I once worked with I'm not sure what to call him now, bioengineer, I guess is the best word. He had created a brain in a vat, which consisted of 12 neurons, which created an array, a lattice. And he made the lattice by using laser light to steer the neurons to grow in a certain direction. So 12 neurons, it was alive. It couldn't do anything very interesting, but he managed to get it alive. But those 12 neurons, that setup with the 12 neurons, in order to keep it alive, it required a huge amount of mechanical, technological support, which weighed altogether 28 kilograms. So if you're now aiming for 100 neurons, you're probably going to be talking about 100 kilograms, and you're not going to be able to create really, really large neuron complexes physically, because the support system that you would need would be too huge. And there are, I don't know, billions of neurons. How many neurons are there in the brain, Jobst?
4 billion.
4 billion neurons. You see, he's my how. 4 billion neurons. It's going to take the whole galaxy to make a support system for 4 billion neurons. But even if you could get 4 billion neurons to communicate with each other in some way, remember what it took to create intelligence on the part of human beings. It took 8 million years of evolution. And people were dying because they could not see, or because they could not hear, or because they didn't have a good circulation. Those people who survived, or those organisms who survived, were the ones who were able to see and were able to hear and so forth. That's why we have, and able to think, that's why we have the intelligence that we have, because the people who didn't have it died. Your neurons are not going to do anything interesting unless you can make them go through an evolutionary process like that. So I think it's a non-starter.
Okay, Stephen, the other Stephen.
Oh yeah, I'm the other Stephen. Steve is fine. It's kind of a weird sideways question, so I'll make it quick. I'm curious, you guys say that our identities are wrapped up in dispositions and capabilities in which we have an interest. You add this part that I think is interesting. And so I guess just out of pure curiosity, do you think it'd be possible to replicate the dispositions and capacities without the interest in having them? And if so, would that still be me?
No, but that's the key, or one of the key elements in the book, which is very, very difficult to formulate. That's Jobst referred to the idea of drive. We're working on it. We know. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was thinking I'd like to read your book, and I also want to go back over this Deacon book, because I have to say it twisted my mind, and it came to sort of similar conclusions that you need teleology from the bottom up. You need neurons that want something, and then subsystems that want things, and then subsystems that want things.
Yeah. So which book? I read a book by Deacon which impressed me, but which one are you talking about?
Incomplete Nature.
Oh no, I haven't read that one, so I will have to look at that.
He seems to know his philosophy as well as I can't judge the physics and the neuroscience, but it's a very impressive book that may just be right.
Yeah, that's the worry.
Yeah, I read it because it changed Dennett's mind about something, I mean, Dennett in his most recent like popular book said something about how Deacon changed his mind about whether it could all be top down, whether it could be
yes,
a sort of a drive from a reinforcement learning type drive at top and nothing else. And Deacon apparently changed his mind about that, and I can see why. And it sounds similar to your thesis that like, look, it's only things that we would call organic that have teleology from the bottom up.
Yeah.
It's weird though. Why would that be? I mean, it's hard to grasp why that's necessary for genuine.
Actually, they are talking about this drivenness. There's also drivenness in inanimate nature, which is energy flows through matter. A good example is the rain system. Yeah, because of the sun, energy is flowing through the water system, making water evaporate, and then clouds form and they rain again, and water flows into the soil, and then sources arise and so on. And this is also a driven system. It's driven by the energy of the sun. But organisms, and this is so fascinating, even with the most primitive ones, they are driven out of themselves.
Right.
So
the parts are for the whole, and the whole is for the parts.
Yeah, they want to, all the time, they want to make energy and use this energy to reproduce and survive. We don't know why, but that's basically why virus is not an organism, because it can't produce energy. And this ability to produce energy on its own is kind of is the secret of life, so to speak, that we don't understand and we can't engineer. And that's what makes organisms. Aristotle called this entelechy or entelechy, so that the telos is inside the organism. And that's what makes them, seems to make them special and also unmodelable.
And that's why we shouldn't fear the superintelligence who will take over the universe, which is what Nick Bostrom's book is about. Nick Bostrom thinks that the danger of a superintelligence taking over the universe is so great that all good philosophers and all good mathematicians should immediately stop doing the work they're doing and focus on what Nick Bostrom says is important.
Yeah, philosophy with a deadline, he says.
Yeah.
And by the way, he is a cryonicist. He has a bracelet and everything.
He has a superpowered juice. What's the word? Juicer, I guess, which he's very proud of, I understand.
David, you had a question?
I think all these attempts, this is different from drivenness, but maybe it's in the neighborhood. Cryogenics, as well as any of the digital immortality, they all have the wrong type of causation. People work in identity. They talk about imminent causation, the earlier stages of an entity producing the later. And if you have this mediation, you're just going to get duplicates. So, I mean, Rothblatt's really cavalier that, oh, it's okay if we have many duplicates of ourselves. We'll just synchronize them. And same with cryogenics. I mean, if death is a loss of integration, if you froze someone who's lost their integration, then you're going to have to reassembly them. And reassembly would be a duplicate because it's not caused, like processes are not caused by the earlier stages. I mean, if you died now and we reassembled all your atoms you had when you were 5, that wouldn't be you because it's not caused by your latest stage. So this isn't the same as drivenness, but it seems you definitely are going to need some sort of imminent causation. Otherwise, you'll probably get, one problem, you could get duplicates because you can just make many versions of someone if there's this intermediary. And then it doesn't seem like it's going to preserve any being if it wasn't this causation of their earlier stages producing the later.
So if you insist on the requirement of imminent causation, presumably for that reason alone, you're going to solve the duplicate problem because you're going to make the reanimation, whether digitally or biologically, impossible.
Right. I think you're always going to just have a duplicate if you have this intermediate. You can. That's always a problem with psychological continuity. You can always get too many versions of it. I'd have to tell you a longer story why you wouldn't have this problem with animalism and twinning. But it just seems you've got to have the right sort of causation. And you clearly don't have it with digital duplication. And I don't even think you'll have it with cryogenics. You'll have to reassemble.
Yeah, I agree.
And maybe they're not dead. Maybe they're suspended, like these cryptobiotic organisms. But if they're actually dead, then you got to reassemble, and then you don't have the causation of the organism. And I don't see any difference between reassembling the frozen and reassembling your atoms that you had at your death, which could then go into someone else's body, and when they die, who then gets reassembled? There's it just won't. You just get puzzles without imminent causation. These puzzles just multiply.
David, thank you very much. This is actually a very good point for us to pick up when we discuss drivenness, Barry, the causation point. That was a very, very good remark. Thank you very much. Very helpful.
So it's nearly midnight in Job's world.
Let's thank our speaker. And
do we have time for one more question? Catherine had a...
It's okay. It's okay.
No, go, please, Catherine. We so rarely
Go ahead.
see you.
I suppose it's almost midnight here too. So my thought was just whether, again, natural selection could mimic a kind of drivenness, or it would give us what looks like drivenness simply if we eliminate any of these kind of false starts, and the computer starts to learn not to take those false starts. Wouldn't that look like it is trying to take, say, a path to a longer chat with a human being in the Turing test or something like that? Wouldn't that mimic a kind of drivenness?
The problem is getting the computer to keep going and it won't keep going without human beings giving it energy and fixing it when things go wrong.
Right.
So
Okay.
That's the difference.
And also creating an evolutionary environment is, I think, a real evolutionary environment is impossible because, again, we have no model for an evolutionary environment. It's actually harder to model an evolutionary environment than to model the human brain, I think.
I guess I was just thinking of something like a crowdsourced phone app where you get to chat with someone and you have to decide within the first 5 minutes whether it's a real person or not, and the computer will gradually get better and better.
That's a kind of reverse Turing test.
Yeah, the problem is that, I mean, to answer this last one, because it's really almost midnight here, if you want me to, Barry, I would say that the variance possibilities in human language are so huge that you cannot have, even if you would have the whole world population phoning for 1,000 years in this test, you wouldn't get enough samples. And that has to do with the nature of the distribution that human language generates. It's actually not a distribution from which you can draw adequate samples. And you need, and if you don't have an adequate sampling space, you cannot train a model. And this is quite a tough argument, but you can read it in the book later on.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.